In a broad sort of way, different large societies could be termed as individualistic or collectivist, and you get very different people and different mindsets, and I suspect different brains coming along with that. We in America are in one of the most individualistic of societies, and capitalism being a system that allows you to go higher and higher up a potential pyramid, and the deal is it comes with fewer and fewer safety nets. By definition, the more stratified a society is, the fewer people you have as peers, the fewer people with whom you have symmetrical, reciprocal relationships, and instead all you have are differing spots and endless hierarchies. And a world in which you have few reciprocal partners is a world with a lot less altruism. Alright, so this brings us to a total impossible juncture, which is to try to make sense in perspective of science as to what the nature is of human nature. You know, on a certain level, the nature of our nature is not to be particularly constrained by our nature. We come up with more social variability than any species out there, more systems of belief, of styles of family structures, of ways of raising children. The capacity for variety that we have is extraordinary.
In a society which is predicated on competition and really very often the ruthless exploitation of one human being by another, the profiteering of other people's problems, and very often the creation of problems for the purpose of profiteering, the ruling ideology will very often justify that behavior by appeals to some fundamental and unalterable human nature. So the myth in our society is that people are competitive by nature, and that they're individualistic, and that they're selfish. The real reality is quite the opposite. We have certain human needs. The only way that you can talk about human nature concretely is by recognizing that there's certain human needs. We have a human need for companionship and for close contact, to be loved, to be attached to be accepted, to be seen, to be received for who we are. If those needs are met, we develop into people who are compassionate and cooperative and who have empathy for other people. So the opposite that we often see in our society is in fact the distortion of human nature, precisely because so few people have their needs met. So yes, you can talk about a human nature, but only in the sense of basic human needs that are instinctively evoked, or I should say certain human needs that lead to certain traits if they are met, and a different set of traits if they're denied.
So, when we recognize the fact that the human organism, which has a great deal of adaptive flexibility, allowing us to survive in many different conditions, is also rigidly programmed for certain environmental requirements or human needs, a social imperative begins to emerge. Just as our bodies require physical nutrients, the human brain demands positive forms of environmental stimulus at all stages of development, while also needing to be protected from other negative forms of stimulus. And if things that should happen do not, or if things that shouldn't happen do, it is now apparent that the door can be opened for not only a cascade of mental and physical diseases, but many detrimental human behaviors as well. So as we turn our perspective now outward and take account for the state of affairs today, we must ask the question, is the condition we have created in the modern world actually supporting our health? Is the bedrock of our socioeconomic system acting as a positive force for human and social development and progress? Or is the foundational gravitation of our society actually going against the core evolutionary requirements needed to create and maintain our personal and social well-being?
So one might ask, where did this all begin? what we have today, really a world in a state of cumulative collapse. You get it started with John Locke. And John Locke introduces property, and he has three provisos for just private right and property. And the three provisos are that there must be enough left over for others, and that you must not let it spoil, and that you, most of all, must mix your labor with it. It seems justified. You mix your labor with the world, then you're entitled to the product, and as long as there's enough left over for others, and as long as it doesn't spoil, you don't allow anything to go to waste, that's okay. Well, he spends a long time of his famous treatise of government, and it's since been the canonical text for economic and political and legal understanding. Is still a classic text of study. Well, what he did is, after he gives the provisos, and you're almost thinking at the time whether you're for private property or not, he's given a very good and plausible and powerful defense of private property here. Well, he drops them. He drops them like that, right in one sentence. He says, well, once the introduction of money came in by men's tacit consent, then it became, and he doesn't say all the provisos are canceled, erased, but that's what happens. So now we have not product and your property earned by your own labor. Oh no, money buys labor now. There's no longer a consideration of whether there's enough left over for others. There's no longer a consideration of whether it spoils, because he says, well, money's like silver and gold can't spoil, therefore monies can't be responsible for waste, which is ridiculous. We're not talking about money and silver, we're talking about what its effects are. It's one non sequitur after another. Just the most startling logical legerdemain that he gets away with here. But it fits the interests of capital owners. Then Adam Smith comes along, and what he adds is the religion to this. Locke started with God made it all this way. This is God's right. And now we get also with Smith coming along, he says it's not only God's, I mean, he's not saying this, but this is what's happening philosophically in principle. He's saying it's not only a question of private property, that's all now presupposed, is given. And that there's money investors that buy labor, given. That there's no limit to how much they can buy of other men's labor, how much they can accumulate, how much inequality, that's all given now. And so he comes along, and what his big idea is, and again, it's just introduced in parentheses, en passant. You know, when people put out the goods for sale and others, you know, the supply, and other people buy them with the demand and so forth, how do we have supply equaling demand or demand equaling supply? How can they come into equilibrium? And that is one of the central notions of economics, is how do they come into equilibrium? And he says it's the invisible hand of the market that brings them into equilibrium. So now we have God is actually immanent. He just didn't give the rights to property and how, you know, all its wherewithal and its natural rights of doing all that Locke said. Now we have the system itself as God. In fact, Smith says, when he talks, and you'll never find this quoted, you have to read the whole of the Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. He says, the scantiness of subsistence sets limits to the reproduction of the poor, and that nature can deal with this in no other way than elimination of their children. So he anticipated evolutionary theory in the worst sense. This is well before Darwin. And so he called them the race of laborers. So you can see there was inherent racism built in here. There was an inherent acceptance, life blindness to kill innumerable children. And he thought, well, that's the invisible hand making supply meet demand and demand meet supply. So see how wise God is. So you can see a lot of the really virulent, life-destructive, eco-genocidal things that are going on now have, in a way, a thought gene back in Smith too.